Welcome, kind listener, to this peaceful haven of history. This is a place where stories flow like a gentle river, carrying us far away from the rush of the present. Whether you are lying in bed, eyes growing heavy, or sitting quietly as the evening settles, know that you are among friends here. If you'd like, share in the comments where you are listening from. I treasure the chance to see how history brings together people from every corner of the world. And if these calm journeys speak to you, go ahead and subscribe, so our paths may cross again in the chapters to come. But for now, let the noise of today drift away, and join me as we wander softly into the mists of the past. There are places in history that haunt us not because they exist, but because they no longer do. Places that once stood as monuments to human achievement, only to vanish, leaving behind echoes and questions that ripple through the centuries. The Library of Alexandria is one such place. Its name alone conjures something ethereal, something almost mythical. A great repository of knowledge, they say, burned to ashes. But what was it really? What did it contain? And what was truly lost when its flames rose into the sky? Tonight, we journey to the edge of the Mediterranean, to a city born from the dreams of a conqueror, built by his successors, and crowned by a library that would become the most famous in the ancient world. We will walk its marble halls in our minds, feel the papyrus scrolls beneath our fingertips, and hear the murmur of scholars debating in courtyards filled with the scent of ink and salt air. And then, we will watch it burn. Not once, but perhaps many times, in many ways, across centuries of turmoil and transformation. But let us not rush. The story of Alexandria begins long before its library ever rose from the ground, and to understand what was lost, we must first understand what was built, and why, and by whom. In the year 331 before the Common Era, a young king stood at the western edge of the Nile Delta, gazing out at the Mediterranean Sea. His name was Alexander, though history would come to call him Alexander the Great. He was 25 years old, already a conqueror of empires, and he had just taken Egypt from the hands of the Persian Empire with barely a drop of blood spilled. The Egyptians, long weary of Persian rule, welcomed him as a liberator, even as a god. The priests of Memphis crowned him pharaoh, and Alexander, ever the dreamer, began to imagine something extraordinary. He had seen many cities in his campaigns. Babylon, with its hanging gardens. Persepolis, with its towering palaces. But Alexander wanted something different. He wanted a city that would be a bridge between worlds, a place where the cultures of Greece and Egypt and all the lands he had conquered might meet and mingle. He wanted a city that would bear his name and outlast his own short life, which he could not have known would end just 8 years later, at the age of 32. The site he chose was perfect. A strip of land between the Mediterranean and Lake Mareotis, protected by the island of Pharos, which could serve as a natural breakwater. The location offered access to trade routes by land and sea, a connection between Africa and the Mediterranean world, between the wealth of Egypt and the markets of Greece and beyond. Alexander sketched the basic plan himself, or so the legends tell us, using barley meal to mark out the streets when chalk could not be found. The birds descended to eat the meal, and the seers traveling with him proclaimed it a good omen, that the city would feed many nations. But Alexander did not stay to see his city built. He moved on, ever eastward, chasing the horizon, conquering lands all the way to the edge of India. And when he died in Babylon in 323, his empire shattered like pottery dropped on stone. His generals, called the Diadochi, the successors, tore his conquests apart in a series of brutal wars that would last for decades. One of these generals was named Ptolemy. He was cunning, patient, and less interested in conquering the whole of Alexander's empire than in securing a rich and defensible piece of it for himself. He claimed Egypt, and with it, he claimed Alexander's vision of a great coastal city. Ptolemy understood something that many conquerors do not: that power built on culture and commerce endures longer than power built on swords alone. Under Ptolemy, who became Ptolemy the First Soter, meaning savior, Alexandria began to rise in earnest. Greek architects and engineers poured into Egypt, bringing with them the mathematical precision and aesthetic sensibilities of the Hellenic world. The city was laid out in a grid, streets crossing at right angles, a design that felt orderly and rational, so different from the winding alleyways of older cities. Broad avenues were lined with colonnades, offering shade from the fierce Egyptian sun. Temples rose to honor both Greek and Egyptian gods, a deliberate fusion meant to unite the diverse peoples now living under Ptolemaic rule. The city grew quickly, fed by the wealth of Egypt's grain and papyrus, by the trade that flowed through its harbors. Within a few decades, Alexandria had become one of the largest and most cosmopolitan cities in the world. Greeks and Egyptians mingled with Jews, Phoenicians, Persians, Indians, and Africans from lands to the south. It was a place of many languages, many faiths, many ways of seeing the world. And in the midst of this vibrant, bustling, sometimes chaotic city, Ptolemy and his son, Ptolemy II Philadelphus, decided to build something unprecedented. They would build a library. Not just a library, but the library, a collection so vast and so comprehensive that it would contain all the knowledge of the known world. Every book, every scroll, every fragment of wisdom from every land. It would be a place where scholars could come to study, to learn, to debate, to push the boundaries of human understanding. It would be a symbol of the Ptolemies' commitment to learning and culture, and it would make Alexandria the intellectual center of the world. The idea was ambitious to the point of hubris, and yet, they pursued it with astonishing determination. The library, often called the Mouseion or Museum, meaning House of the Muses, was built within the royal quarter of Alexandria, near the palace. It was not simply a repository of scrolls, but a kind of ancient research institute, a place where scholars could live and work, supported by royal patronage. They were given stipends, provided with food, exempted from taxes. In return, they dedicated their lives to the pursuit of knowledge. The first head of the library was Demetrius of Phaleron, an Athenian philosopher and former governor who had fled to Alexandria after falling out of favor in his homeland. Demetrius brought with him a vision of what the library could become. He advised Ptolemy to collect books on kingship and governance, naturally, but also works of poetry, philosophy, mathematics, medicine, astronomy, geography, and history. Every subject, every tradition, every voice. And so the collecting began. The Ptolemies sent agents across the known world with one mission: acquire scrolls. They bought entire private libraries. They commissioned translations of foreign texts. They sent scholars to distant cities to copy manuscripts. Ships arriving at Alexandria's port were searched, and any books found on board were confiscated, copied, and sometimes the copies returned to the owners while the originals were kept for the library. It was piracy in the service of knowledge, and it filled the shelves rapidly. The most famous of these acquisitions involved the official Athenian copies of the great tragedies, the works of Aeschylus, Sophocles, and Euripides. Ptolemy III borrowed these priceless manuscripts from Athens, offering an enormous deposit as security for their return. He had them copied, but when the time came to return them, he sent back the copies and kept the originals, forfeiting the deposit without a second thought. The message was clear: Alexandria would have the best, the oldest, the most authoritative texts, no matter the cost. But acquiring scrolls was only the beginning. The library also became a center of scholarship unlike any the world had seen. Think of it: a place where a mathematician from Sicily might work alongside an astronomer from Babylonia, where a Jewish scholar might debate theology with a Greek philosopher, where an Egyptian priest might share ancient medical texts with a physician from Asia Minor. The cross-pollination of ideas must have been extraordinary. Let us walk, for a moment, through the library as it might have been. Imagine stepping through a grand entrance, flanked by columns of marble, cool and white in the morning sun. Inside, the air is dimmer, filled with the scent of papyrus and cedar wood, for the shelves and scroll cases were often made of cedar to repel insects. The walls are lined with pigeonholes, each containing rolled scrolls, some neatly tagged with small leather or papyrus labels indicating their contents. Author, title, subject. The organization is meticulous, an early attempt at cataloging on a massive scale. In one hall, you might find the works of Homer, dozens of different versions and commentaries, for the scholars of Alexandria made it their mission to produce definitive editions of important texts, comparing manuscripts, correcting errors, adding critical notes. In another room, mathematical treatises, diagrams drawn carefully on papyrus, exploring the mysteries of geometry and arithmetic. In another, medical texts describing treatments for ailments, surgical techniques, the workings of the human body as understood by the ancients. And everywhere, people. Scholars hunched over scrolls, squinting in the light that filters through high windows. Scribes copying texts, their hands moving steadily, inkpots at their sides. Librarians organizing, cataloging, retrieving requested works. Young students listening to lectures in courtyards, where fountains splash softly and the sound of intellectual debate rises and falls like music. Let us speak of some of these scholars, for they are the true treasure of the library, even more than the scrolls themselves. There was Euclid, who arrived in Alexandria in the early days of the library and wrote his Elements, a work of geometry that would remain the standard mathematical textbook for over 2,000 years. His proofs and theorems, written on papyrus in this city by the sea, would shape the minds of mathematicians from the Islamic Golden Age to the Renaissance and beyond. There was Eratosthenes, a polymath of staggering range. He was a mathematician, geographer, poet, astronomer, and music theorist. He served as the chief librarian for many years, and during his tenure, he did something remarkable. Using only simple observations and geometry, he calculated the circumference of the Earth with astonishing accuracy. He had heard that in the town of Syene, far to the south, the sun shone directly overhead at noon on the summer solstice, casting no shadow. In Alexandria, at the same moment, the sun cast a shadow at an angle of about 7 degrees. Eratosthenes knew the distance between Alexandria and Syene, and using these two pieces of information, he calculated the Earth's circumference to within a small margin of error. Think of that. No satellites, no modern instruments, just observation and reason. There was Aristarchus of Samos, who proposed, centuries before Copernicus, that the Earth revolves around the Sun, not the other way around. His ideas were considered radical, even heretical, and they did not gain wide acceptance in his time, but the fact that he could propose them at all, that he could calculate the relative sizes and distances of the Sun and Moon, speaks to the intellectual freedom and rigor that the library fostered. There was Callimachus, a poet and scholar who created the Pinox, a massive catalogue of the library's holdings, organized by subject and author. It ran to 120 volumes and served as a kind of ancient bibliography, an attempt to organize all of human knowledge. Fragments of this work survive, and they give us glimpses of just how vast the collection had become. There was Apollonius of Perga, who wrote on conic sections, exploring the geometry of ellipses, parabolas, and hyperbolas, work that would later prove essential to understanding planetary motion. There was Herophilus, a physician who conducted some of the first systematic dissections of human bodies, advancing the understanding of anatomy and the workings of the nervous system. There was Ctesibius, an inventor who created the first water clock and experimented with hydraulics and pneumatics, building mechanical wonders that astonished his contemporaries. And there were countless others, names we know and names lost to time, all drawn to Alexandria by the promise of resources, of freedom, of community. The library was not just a building. It was an idea made manifest, the idea that knowledge is worth pursuing for its own sake, that understanding the world is one of the highest human endeavors. But what did the library actually contain? We must be honest here. We do not know with precision. No catalog survives intact. No inventory has come down to us. Ancient sources give wildly varying estimates of the number of scrolls, ranging from 40,000 to 700,000 or more. Some of these numbers may refer to the number of individual scrolls, others to the number of works, which could be spread across multiple scrolls. A single copy of the Histories of Herodotus, for instance, might occupy several scrolls. What we can say with confidence is that the library contained works of Greek literature and philosophy, certainly. Homer, Hesiod, the playwrights, the historians like Herodotus and Thucydides, the philosophers Plato and Aristotle. It contained scientific and mathematical works from the Greek world and beyond. It held Egyptian texts, both religious and practical, some translated into Greek. It had Jewish scriptures, most famously the Septuagint, the Greek translation of the Hebrew Bible, which tradition says was created by 72 scholars working in Alexandria at the request of Ptolemy II. There were likely works from Persia, from India, from the lands of Mesopotamia. Astronomical tables, medical treatises, agricultural manuals, works of engineering, poetry and languages most Alexandrians could not read. There were rare texts, unique copies, works that existed nowhere else in the world. And there were commentaries upon commentaries, layers of scholarship building on older scholarship, a conversation across generations. The library also had competition, or perhaps a companion. A second library was built in Alexandria, attached to the Temple of Serapis, known as the Serapeum. This was smaller than the main library but still significant, said to contain tens of thousands of scrolls. It served as a kind of public library, more accessible to ordinary citizens, while the great library in the royal quarter remained more exclusive, reserved for serious scholars. For centuries, this system endured. The Ptolemies continued to support the library, though their dynasty grew increasingly troubled. They were a strange family, the Ptolemies, brilliant and cruel and often both at once. They married their siblings, murdered their relatives, ruled with a combination of Greek sophistication and Egyptian autocracy. They built temples and waged wars, patronized artists, and executed rivals. But through it all, for a long time, they protected the library. Alexandria itself continued to grow and change. It became famous for its lighthouse, the Pharos, one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world, a towering structure that guided ships safely into harbor. It became known for its diverse population, its vibrant street life, its markets and theaters and temples. But it also became known for its tensions. The Greeks, who formed the ruling class, looked down on the native Egyptians. The Jews, who formed a large and distinct community, sometimes clashed with both. Riots broke out periodically, brutal affairs that left streets stained with blood. And always, there was the broader world to contend with. The Ptolemaic kingdom was wealthy and cultured, but it was not invincible. To the east, the Seleucid Empire, another of Alexander's successor states, was a constant rival. To the west, Carthage and later Rome loomed large. To the south, the kingdoms of Nubia and Kush represented different worlds, older and no less powerful in their own ways. Rome, especially, would come to matter. Rome, that hungry city on the Tiber, was expanding relentlessly, consuming the Mediterranean world piece by piece. By the time of Julius Caesar, in the middle of the 1st century before the Common Era, Egypt was one of the last major Hellenistic kingdoms still standing, and it was tottering. The pharaoh at that time was Ptolemy XIII, a boy of perhaps 13, co-ruling with his older sister and wife, Cleopatra VII. Yes, that Cleopatra, the one whose name has echoed through history wrapped in legend and romance. She was in her early 20s, highly educated, fluent in multiple languages, politically astute, and locked in a bitter power struggle with her brother and his advisors. When civil war erupted in Rome between Julius Caesar and Pompey the Great, Cleopatra saw an opportunity. Pompey fled to Egypt seeking refuge, but Ptolemy's advisors, hoping to curry favor with Caesar, had Pompey murdered as he stepped ashore. It was a miscalculation. Caesar, when he arrived in Alexandria shortly after, was furious. He had been Pompey's rival, yes, but also his former ally, and the murder struck him as an act of base treachery. Caesar installed himself in the royal palace and declared that he would arbitrate the dispute between Ptolemy and Cleopatra. Cleopatra, barred from the palace, famously had herself smuggled and rolled up in a carpet or, as some sources suggest, a sack of bedding. She met Caesar, charmed him, and enlisted his support. Caesar, ever the opportunist and perhaps genuinely captivated, sided with her. This decision plunged Alexandria into chaos. Ptolemy's supporters, realizing that Caesar intended to place Cleopatra on the throne, rose in rebellion. The palace quarter came under siege. Caesar, with only a small force of Roman soldiers, found himself trapped, his supply lines cut, facing a hostile city and an Egyptian army. And it is here, in the midst of this siege, that the first great destruction of the library may have occurred. Or perhaps not. The sources are frustratingly vague, contradictory, written generations after the fact. What seems to have happened is this: Caesar, desperate to maintain control of the harbor, ordered his men to set fire to the Egyptian fleet anchored there. The fire spread, consuming not only the ships but also warehouses along the docks. Some ancient writers claim that these warehouses contained scrolls, possibly tens of thousands of them, either stored for export or awaiting delivery to the library. Did the great library itself burn in Caesar's fire? Probably not. The library was in the royal quarter, some distance from the harbor. But did a significant collection of books burn? Quite possibly. How many? We cannot say. Some sources speak of 40,000 scrolls lost, others say 400,000, others do not mention books at all. Later writers, seeking to assign blame or mitigate it, shaped the story to suit their purposes. Some accused Caesar of cultural vandalism, others argued that the fire was contained and the damage minimal. What we can say is that the library survived this crisis, though perhaps diminished. Caesar eventually won the Alexandrian War, Ptolemy drowned fleeing through the Nile Delta, and Cleopatra became the undisputed ruler of Egypt, backed by Roman power. The library continued to function, though whether it ever fully recovered its former glory is unclear. Cleopatra herself was a patron of learning. She spoke 9 languages, we are told, and was deeply interested in medicine, alchemy, and cosmetics, even supposedly writing works on these subjects, though none survive. She and Caesar had a son, Arion, and after Caesar's assassination, she allied herself with Mark Antony, one of Caesar's successors. Together, they ruled the eastern Mediterranean, styling themselves as the new Alexander and the new Isis, dreaming perhaps of an empire that could rival Rome itself. It was not to be. In the year 31 before the Common Era, Antony and Cleopatra faced Octavian, Caesar's adopted heir and the future Emperor Augustus, at the naval battle of Actium. They were defeated. They fled back to Alexandria, but there was no escape. The following year, as Octavian's forces closed in, Antony and Cleopatra both took their own lives. Egypt, the last of the great Hellenistic kingdoms, became a province of Rome. And the library? It remained, but its status changed. No longer supported by an independent monarchy devoted to the glory of Greek culture, it now existed at the pleasure of Roman governors and emperors, some of whom cared about learning and some of whom did not. Rome was a practical civilization, more interested in roads and aqueducts and legions than in pure scholarship. Some emperors, like Claudius, were genuine scholars and added to Alexandria's libraries. Others paid them little mind. Over the following centuries, the library faced a slow erosion. There were accidents, fires, the wear and tear of time. Papyrus is fragile. Scrolls decay. Insects devour them, moisture rots them, careless handling tears them. Without constant maintenance, constant copying, constant renewal, a library does not simply endure. It requires effort, resources, commitment. There were also deliberate destructions, or so the stories tell. In the year 273 of the Common Era, the Roman Emperor Aurelian fought to reclaim Alexandria from a breakaway faction. The fighting was fierce, and the royal quarter, where the main library stood, was badly damaged. Some sources say the library was destroyed at this time, its buildings burned or torn down. Others say it had already dwindled to insignificance by then, the great collections dispersed or lost. The Serapeum, the daughter library, lasted longer. It continued to function through the 3rd and 4th centuries, a beacon for pagan learning in a world that was rapidly changing. For by this time, a new force had risen, one that would reshape the Mediterranean world as thoroughly as Rome had: Christianity. Christianity, born in the Judean desert, had spread throughout the Roman Empire, growing from a persecuted sect to the official state religion by the end of the 4th century. With this shift came new tensions. Pagan temples were closed, their priesthoods disbanded, their traditions suppressed. Philosophers and scholars who clung to the old gods found themselves increasingly marginalized, even in danger. In Alexandria, these tensions ran especially high. The city had always been a place of religious diversity, but now that diversity was hardening into conflict. Christians and pagans clashed in the streets. Mobs formed, fueled by zealotry and the rhetoric of bishops who saw the old learning as a threat to the new faith. In the year 391, the Christian Emperor Theodosius issued a decree ordering the destruction of pagan temples throughout the empire. In Alexandria, the bishop, a fierce man named Theophilus, led a Christian mob to the Serapeum. They stormed the temple complex, tore down the statues, smashed the altars, and burned what they could. The great statue of Serapis, a syncretic god combining Greek and Egyptian elements, was destroyed with particular relish, its pieces carried through the streets in mockery. Did they also burn the library that was housed within the Serapeum? Almost certainly, yes. Ancient sources describe scrolls being destroyed, though by this time the collection may have been much reduced from its peak. Some scholars argue that the most valuable texts had already been removed or dispersed. Others believe that a significant portion of the library's holdings perished in the flames that day. But let us step back for a moment. Let us not simply recount destruction after destruction, but consider what it meant. Each time a library burns, whether in Alexandria or anywhere else, it is not just papyrus and ink that are lost. It is voices. It is ideas. It is the accumulated understanding of generations, the record of what people thought and discovered and imagined. When the Library of Alexandria burned, we lost works of literature we will never read. Plays by Sophocles that exist now only as titles mentioned in ancient catalogs. Epics from cultures we know almost nothing about. Scientific treatises that might have contained insights centuries ahead of their time. Historical accounts that could have clarified mysteries that still puzzle us. Philosophical arguments that might have changed the course of thought. We lost diversity of perspective. The library contained not just Greek texts but works from across the known world, reflecting different ways of understanding the cosmos, the human body, the nature of the divine. When those texts burned, the chance to learn from those perspectives, to see the world through different eyes, vanished with them. We lost continuity. So much of what we know about the ancient world comes to us through chains of copying and transmission, texts preserved by being copied again and again, passing from one library to another, one generation to the next. When the library burned, those chains were broken. Texts that existed in only one or two copies simply ceased to exist. The knowledge they contained became as if it had never been. Consider the works of the great playwrights of Athens. Aeschylus wrote perhaps 90 plays. We have 7. Sophocles wrote over 120. We have 7. Euripides wrote 92. We have 18, plus one that may not be his. What happened to all the rest? Some were lost through the ordinary decay of time, but many may have been in Alexandria, in libraries that burned or were destroyed or simply neglected until the scrolls crumbled to dust. Consider the scholars of the library itself. We know that Eratosthenes wrote multiple works on geography, literary criticism, chronology, and mathematics. Fragments survive, quotations in later authors, but the full texts are gone. Callimachus wrote poetry, hymns, epigrams, and that enormous catalogue of the library. Most of it is lost. Aristarchus of Samothrace, one of the greatest textual critics of antiquity, who produced definitive editions of Homer and other poets, left behind scholarship that we know about only because others quoted him. The library also held scientific knowledge that might have changed history had it survived. The Greeks and Hellenistic scholars had made remarkable advances in astronomy, understanding that the Earth was round, calculating its size, even proposing heliocentric models of the solar system. They had created steam engines, though only as toys and curiosities. They had begun to understand the principles of anatomy and medicine, conducting dissections and experiments. Had this knowledge been preserved and built upon, might the scientific revolution have come centuries earlier? We cannot know, but the question haunts. And then there were the works of other cultures. Alexandria was a crossroads, and its library reflected that. It held Egyptian texts, medical and magical and religious. It held Jewish scriptures and commentaries. It held works translated from Persian, from Sanskrit, from languages we may not even be able to identify. When those texts were lost, we lost windows into worlds that are now almost entirely closed to us. But let us return to the narrative of destruction, for the story of the library's end is not finished. By the 5th century, the great library in the royal quarter was certainly gone, whether destroyed gradually or in some cataclysm. The Serapeum, too, was no more. But Alexandria still had libraries, still had scholars, though in dwindling numbers. One of these scholars was Hypatia, a mathematician and philosopher who lived in the early 5th century. She was the daughter of Theon, himself a notable mathematician and astronomer, and she became one of the most respected intellectuals of her time. She taught philosophy, particularly Neoplatonism, and was known for her work on mathematics and astronomy. She was also a pagan in an increasingly Christian city, a woman who spoke with authority in a world that often silenced women, a symbol of the old learning in a time that was determined to leave the old world behind. In 415, during a period of intense political and religious conflict in Alexandria, Hypatia was murdered by a Christian mob, possibly incited by the bishop Cyril. They dragged her from her chariot, stripped her, and killed her with tiles or shards of pottery, her body torn apart and burned. It was a brutal act, and it shocked even many Christians at the time. Hypatia's death is often seen as symbolic of the death of the old classical world, the end of an era when reason and philosophy could be pursued freely. After Hypatia, the scholarly community in Alexandria never recovered its former vitality. Some learning continued, particularly in Christian theology and medicine, but the days of the great secular library, of the free exchange of ideas from all traditions, were over. And then, in the 7th century, came another wave of change. Arab Muslim armies, exploding out of the Arabian Peninsula in a series of rapid conquests, swept across the Middle East and North Africa. In 641, they took Alexandria, ending nearly 1,000 years of Greek and Roman rule. The city's status changed once again. It remained important, but it was no longer a capital, no longer the jewel of the Mediterranean. A legend arose, recorded centuries later, that the Arab commander Amr ibn al-As wrote to the Caliph Umar asking what to do with the books in Alexandria. Umar is said to have replied, "If the books agree with the Quran, they are unnecessary. If they disagree, they are undesirable. In either case, they should be destroyed." And so, according to this story, the scrolls were used to fuel the fires of Alexandria's bathhouses, and they burned for 6 months. It is a compelling story, but almost certainly false. It appears in no contemporary sources, emerging only in the 12th century, 500 years after the supposed event, and recorded by an author hostile to Islam. Modern historians regard it as a fabrication, possibly created during the Crusades to demonize Muslims. By the time the Arabs took Alexandria, the great libraries were long gone. There was no vast collection of scrolls to burn. The story is a myth, but a revealing one, showing how the loss of the library became a weapon in later cultural and religious conflicts. The truth is more complex and sadder. The library did not die in a single dramatic conflagration. It died slowly, over centuries, from many causes. Fire and war, yes, but also neglect, lack of funding, changing priorities, religious intolerance, and the simple, inexorable decay of materials. Scrolls that were not copied rotted away. Buildings that were not maintained crumbled. Scholars who were not supported went elsewhere or ceased their work. The library faded like a sunset, light draining from the sky until only darkness remained. What did the world lose when the library vanished? This is a question that can never be fully answered, because we can never know what we do not know. But we can make educated guesses, based on references in surviving texts, on the fragments and quotations that remain, on the sudden silences in the historical record. We lost the majority of ancient literature. It is estimated that we possess less than 1% of all the books written in antiquity. The rest is gone, and much of it may have been in Alexandria. Entire genres of literature have vanished. We know, for instance, that there was a rich tradition of Greek novels, ancient romances and adventure stories, but only a handful survive. There were vast historical works, covering peoples and events that are now obscure or unknown. There were scientific treatises that might have contained observations and theories that we had to rediscover slowly, painfully, over the following centuries. We lost knowledge of ancient science and technology. The Greeks and Hellenistic scholars knew things that were forgotten and had to be learned again. They understood optics, mechanics, hydraulics, pneumatics. They built devices that would not be replicated until the Renaissance or later. The Antikythera mechanism, an ancient Greek analog computer used to predict astronomical positions and eclipses, shows the level of sophistication they had achieved. How much more did they know that was recorded in scrolls now turned to dust? We lost perspectives on philosophy and religion. The ancient world was philosophically diverse in a way that is hard to imagine. There were dozens of schools of thought, different ways of understanding ethics, metaphysics, the nature of the soul, the gods, the cosmos. Many of these perspectives are now known only through hostile descriptions by their opponents, or not known at all. The library would have held works representing this diversity, and when it burned, many voices were silenced forever. We lost connections to other cultures. Alexandria was a place where Greek learning met Egyptian wisdom, where Jewish scholars debated with Greek philosophers, where texts from Persia and India might be translated and studied. These cross-cultural exchanges are crucial to the advancement of knowledge, as ideas from different traditions challenge and enrich each other. The library facilitated such exchanges, and its loss severed connections that took centuries to rebuild, if they were rebuilt at all. But perhaps most poignantly, we lost the stories. History is made of stories, the narratives people tell about themselves, their ancestors, their gods, their world. Every book in the library contained stories, whether they were framed as history, myth, science, or philosophy. And when those books burned, the stories were lost. People whose lives and deeds and thoughts might have mattered, who might have spoken to us across the centuries, were erased. Not by intention, perhaps, but erased nonetheless, and we are poorer for it. There is a melancholy to this that goes beyond mere loss of information. It is a reminder of fragility, of how easily human achievement can be undone. We build, and time and chance tear down. We create, and fire consumes. We remember, and then we forget, and the forgetting is so complete that we do not even remember what we have forgotten. The Library of Alexandria has become, in the modern imagination, a symbol of this fragility. It represents the great might-have-been of history, the parallel world where the ancient knowledge survived, where the continuity of learning was unbroken, where the Renaissance happened 1,000 years earlier because the texts were never lost. We cannot help but wonder, what would our world look like if the library had endured? Would we have reached the stars sooner? Would diseases that ravaged humanity for centuries have been conquered earlier? Would our philosophy be richer, our art more diverse, our understanding of the human condition more profound? Or would it have made little difference, the same discoveries eventually made, the same conclusions eventually reached, just by different paths? We cannot know. And that uncertainty, that sense of doors closed and keys lost, is part of what makes the story of the library so haunting. But let us not end in despair. Because there is another side to this story, one that offers a measure of hope. The Library of Alexandria is gone, but the idea of the library, the dream of gathering and preserving knowledge, did not die with it. That dream has been reborn again and again, in different places and different forms. The Islamic world, during its golden age from roughly the 8th to the 14th century, created libraries that rivaled Alexandria. The House of Wisdom in Baghdad, established in the early 9th century, became a center of translation and scholarship, where Greek, Persian, and Indian texts were rendered into Arabic and studied intensely. Scholars like Al-Khwarizmi, who gave us algebra, and Ibn Sina, known in the West as Avicenna, who wrote medical texts used for centuries, built on the foundations of ancient knowledge and extended them. In medieval Europe, monasteries preserved texts through the Dark Ages, monks copying manuscripts by hand, ensuring that at least some of the classical tradition survived. Universities arose, with their own libraries, and the printing press eventually made books cheaper and more widely available than ever before. In the modern era, we have built libraries that would have astonished the Ptolemies. The Library of Congress, the British Library, the great national and university libraries around the world, each holding millions of volumes. We have digitized texts, making them accessible to anyone with an internet connection. We have created archives and databases and repositories of knowledge that are, in a sense, the descendants of Alexandria. And we have learned, though sometimes painfully, the importance of preserving knowledge, of creating redundancy, of not placing all our intellectual treasures in a single place. The modern world understands, in a way the ancient world could not, that information must be distributed, backed up, protected against the inevitable accidents and catastrophes that time brings. Yet even now, the lesson of Alexandria remains urgent. Libraries still burn. In 1992, during the siege of Sarajevo, the National Library of Bosnia and Herzegovina was shelled and set ablaze. Over 2 million books, manuscripts, and documents were destroyed, including irreplaceable records of the region's history and culture. In 2003, after the invasion of Iraq, the National Library and Archives in Baghdad was looted and burned, losing collections that dated back centuries, including Ottoman records and rare Islamic manuscripts. These losses remind us that the threat to knowledge is not merely historical. It is ongoing. War, political instability, religious extremism, simple neglect, all continue to endanger the repositories of human learning. And now we face new challenges. Digital decay, where information stored on obsolete formats becomes inaccessible, cyber attacks that can wipe out databases in seconds, and the sheer overwhelming volume of information being created, which makes preservation and curation more difficult than ever. But let us return to Alexandria itself, to the city and the library, and consider what they meant in their own time, not just as symbols for us, but as living realities for the people who walked their streets and studied their scrolls. Imagine being a scholar in the library's golden age, in the 3rd century before the Common Era. You have traveled from Athens, perhaps, or Syracuse, or some smaller city, drawn by reputation and the promise of royal patronage. You arrive by ship, and as you approach the harbor, you see the Pharos lighthouse rising impossibly high, its fire burning at the top, smoke trailing into the blue sky. The city spreads out before you, white stone gleaming, the streets laid out in their rational grid, so different from the ancient cities you have known. You make your way to the palace quarter, present your letters of introduction, and you are accepted. You are given quarters, simple but comfortable, and access to the library. The first time you enter, you are overwhelmed. You have heard of private libraries, collections of a few hundred scrolls owned by wealthy men, but this is something else entirely. Row upon row, hall upon hall, more books than you imagined existed in the world. You spend your days reading, making notes on wax tablets or scraps of papyrus. You request specific texts, and librarians bring them to you, unrolling them carefully. You discover works you have never heard of, ideas that challenge everything you thought you knew. You attend lectures, where visiting scholars present their latest research. You debate with other residents of the Mouseion, sometimes far into the night, in courtyards where the stars will overhead and the sound of the sea whispers in the distance. You have been given a problem to work on, perhaps a mathematical puzzle or a question about the movements of the planets, or you have chosen one yourself. You have time to think deeply, resources to pursue your inquiries, colleagues to sharpen your arguments. This is luxury of a kind that most scholars in history could never dream of. You are being paid to think, to learn, to add to the sum of human knowledge. And you are aware, even in your own time, that this is extraordinary. The library is famous across the known world. Scholars speak of it with reverence or envy. Rulers of other cities try to create their own libraries, but none quite match Alexandria's collection or reputation. Pergamum, in Asia Minor, builds a significant library, and the rivalry becomes so intense that the Ptolemies supposedly banned the export of papyrus to prevent Pergamum from growing its collection, leading the Pergamenes to develop parchment as an alternative writing surface. But Alexandria remains supreme. And for a scholar working there is a sense of participating in something larger than yourself. You are part of a great project, the attempt to gather and understand all knowledge. It is audacious, perhaps impossible, but the very attempt is ennobling. Of course, life in Alexandria is not entirely devoted to scholarship. The city is vibrant and sometimes dangerous. Riots break out over politics or religion. The palace is full of intrigue, as the Ptolemies and their courtiers scheme and plot. The streets are crowded with merchants and sailors and beggars, with priests of a dozen different gods, with soldiers from distant lands. You hear languages you cannot identify, see customs that seem strange or barbaric. The city is wealthy, but the wealth is unevenly distributed. The Greek elite live in luxury, but the native Egyptians, who form the bulk of the population, often live in poverty. The Jews have their own quarter, their own synagogues, their own tensions with both the Greeks and the Egyptians. Alexandria is a cosmopolitan city, but cosmopolitanism does not always mean harmony. It can also mean conflict, as different groups vie for power and resources. And yet, despite these tensions, the library functions. It transcends, to some degree, the divisions of the city. Scholars from different backgrounds work side by side. A Jewish scholar might translate Hebrew texts into Greek, making them accessible to a wider audience. An Egyptian priest might share ancient medical knowledge. A Greek philosopher might incorporate ideas from Persian or Indian sources into his work. This exchange, this cross-pollination, is part of what makes the library so important. It is not simply a repository of Greek culture, though it certainly preserves and celebrates that. It is a meeting place of cultures, a space where different traditions can encounter each other, not always easily, but productively. Let us consider the Septuagint again, the Greek translation of the Hebrew Bible. According to tradition, Ptolemy II wanted a copy of the Jewish laws for his library. He sent to Jerusalem and requested that scholars be sent to Alexandria to produce a translation. 72 scholars arrived, 6 from each of the 12 tribes of Israel. They were housed on the island of Pharos, and they worked independently, each producing their own translation. When they finished, miraculously, all 72 translations were identical, a sign of divine inspiration. The historical reality was probably less miraculous and more gradual, but the story tells us something important. The Septuagint became the Bible of Greek-speaking Jews, and later, of early Christians. It allowed Jewish thought to enter the broader Hellenistic world, influencing Greek philosophy and eventually Christianity itself. Without the library, without the Ptolemies' desire to collect texts from all peoples, this translation might never have been made, and the history of Western religion might have been very different. Or consider the work of Claudius Ptolemy, who lived in Alexandria in the 2nd century of the Common Era, much later than the library's golden age, but still benefiting from its legacy. He was an astronomer, mathematician, and geographer, and he synthesized the work of earlier scholars into comprehensive treatises. His Almagest became the standard astronomical text for over 1,000 years, and his geography shaped how people understood the world well into the Renaissance. Ptolemy built on the work of Hipparchus, who had lived centuries earlier and had compiled star catalogs and developed trigonometry. He used observations from Babylonian astronomers, whose records stretched back centuries. He drew on the mathematical techniques developed by Euclid and Apollonius. All of this was possible because the library had preserved these earlier works, making them accessible to later scholars. Ptolemy stood on the shoulders of giants, but only because the library had kept those giants' works alive. This is the true function of a great library, not just to store books, but to enable the transmission of knowledge across time and space. Each generation can build on the work of the last, not starting from scratch but beginning from a higher level. This is how civilizations advance, how understanding deepens. When the library was lost, this chain was broken. The Dark Ages were dark not because people became stupid, but because they lost access to the accumulated knowledge of the past. They had to start over, rediscovering things that had been known centuries before. It was an immense waste, a tragedy not just for those who lived through it, but for all of us who came after. But let us also consider what survived. Not everything was lost. Some texts were preserved in other libraries, in Constantinople, in monasteries scattered across Europe, in the Islamic world. Some were copied and recopied, passing through many hands, slowly making their way from one culture to another. The works of Aristotle, for instance, were largely lost to Western Europe for centuries after the fall of Rome. But they were preserved in Arabic translations, studied by Islamic scholars, and eventually retranslated into Latin in the 12th and 13th centuries. Their return sparked a revolution in European thought, contributing to the rise of scholasticism and the universities. Euclid's Elements was also preserved in Arabic, and it too returned to Europe, where it became the foundation of mathematical education. The medical works of Galen and Hippocrates, preserved and expanded by Islamic physicians, eventually made their way back to Europe, shaping Western medicine for centuries. These survivals remind us that knowledge is resilient. It wants to be shared, to be copied, to spread. Even when libraries burn, even when civilizations fall, ideas find a way to persist, carried by people who value them, who recognize their importance. The Library of Alexandria may have burned, but the spirit that animated it, the hunger for knowledge and understanding, did not die. It re-emerged in Baghdad and Cordoba, in the monasteries of Ireland and the universities of Paris and Bologna, in the print shops of Renaissance Italy and the scientific societies of Enlightenment Europe, in the libraries and archives and databases of the modern world. And perhaps that is the real lesson of Alexandria. The library was a physical place, and physical places can be destroyed. But the idea of the library, the commitment to preserving and sharing knowledge, is an idea that transcends any single place or time. It is one of humanity's best impulses, the recognition that we are part of a continuous conversation, that what we learn and discover should not die with us but should be passed on to those who come after. Let us think, for a moment, about what it means to lose a book. In our age of mass production and digital copies, it is hard to grasp. If a book is popular, there may be millions of copies. If it is rare, we can scan it, put it online, ensure that even if every physical copy is destroyed, the text survives. But in the ancient world, every book was unique. Each copy had to be made by hand, a scribe painstakingly transcribing the text, letter by letter. It was slow, expensive, and prone to errors. Many texts existed in only a handful of copies. If all those copies were in one place, and that place burned, the text was gone forever. Imagine holding such a book in your hands. You know it is the only copy, or one of very few. If you destroy it, the words it contains will be lost, the thoughts of the person who wrote it will be silenced. There is a weight to that, a responsibility. The librarians of Alexandria understood this. They treated the scrolls in their care with reverence, not because the scrolls themselves were sacred, but because what they contained was irreplaceable. And when the library burned, whether all at once or gradually over centuries, that reverence was not enough. The scrolls burned anyway. The words were lost. The voices fell silent. There is something almost unbearable about this. To know that there were plays as beautiful as those of Sophocles, poems as moving as those of Sappho, ideas as revolutionary as those of Aristarchus, and we will never know them. They existed once. People read them, were moved by them, argued about them. And now they are gone, as if they never were. But perhaps there is also something instructive in this loss. It reminds us that nothing is permanent, that everything we create is fragile, that preservation requires effort and intention. The library did not survive on its own. It survived as long as people valued it, supported it, protected it. When that support failed, when priorities changed, when violence and intolerance and neglect took over, the library fell. We face similar choices today. We have vast amounts of information, more than any previous age. But information is not the same as knowledge, and knowledge is not the same as wisdom. We must choose what to preserve, what to value, what to pass on. We must protect our libraries and archives, not just from fire and war, but from budget cuts and political interference, from censorship and book banning, from the slow rot of neglect. The Library of Alexandria stands as both an inspiration and a warning. It shows us what is possible when a society commits to learning, when it values knowledge for its own sake, when it creates spaces where scholars can work and ideas can flourish. But it also shows us what can be lost when that commitment falters, when violence and intolerance triumph, when the long-term project of civilization gives way to the short-term demands of power and survival. Let us imagine, one more time, the library in its final days. Perhaps there was a moment when the last scholar walked out of the main library for the last time, not knowing it was the last time. Perhaps the building stood empty for years, slowly decaying, scrolls moldering in their pigeonholes, before finally being torn down or repurposed. Perhaps the Serapeum's destruction was more dramatic, flames rising as the Christian mob celebrated, convinced they were doing God's work. Whoever witnessed these destructions, if anyone did with full understanding of what was being lost, must have felt a profound grief. Not just for the books themselves, but for what they represented. The belief that knowledge matters, that understanding is worth pursuing, that the questions humans ask about the world and themselves and the divine are important and deserve careful, sustained attention. That belief did not die with the library, but it was wounded. It took centuries to recover, and in some ways, we are still recovering. We are still trying to rebuild what was lost, to piece together fragments, to understand what the ancient world knew and thought. And in doing so, we honor the memory of the library, not by dwelling on what was lost, but by continuing the work that was begun there. Every time a scholar pushes the boundaries of knowledge, every time a student discovers the joy of learning, every time a society chooses to support education and research and the free exchange of ideas, the spirit of Alexandria lives again. The scrolls may be ashes, but the flame of inquiry still burns. The building may be ruins, but the foundation it laid remains. The voices may be silent, but new voices rise, asking the same questions, seeking the same understanding, adding their own insights to the conversation that spans generations and cultures. This is the paradox of the library's destruction. What was lost is immeasurable, and we should mourn it. But what survived, the idea of the library, the value of knowledge, the commitment to learning, is perhaps even more powerful because it has been tested and has endured. The Library of Alexandria is gone, but we can build new libraries. We can gather knowledge, preserve it, share it. We can create spaces, physical and virtual, where minds can meet and ideas can flourish. We can be the inheritors of that ancient dream, the librarians of a new age, protecting and extending the human conversation. And perhaps, in some far future, when our own civilization has passed into memory, someone will look back at what we built and what we lost, and they will tell stories about us. They will wonder at our achievements and mourn our failures. They will ask what we knew and what we forgot. And they, too, will face the choice of what to preserve and what to let go. This is the cycle of history, the endless rhythm of creation and destruction, memory and forgetting. We cannot stop it. But we can choose which side we are on. We can choose to be builders, not destroyers. We can choose to preserve, not to burn. We can choose to remember, not to forget. The Library of Alexandria is a wound in history, a gap where there should be fullness, a silence where there should be voices. But from that wound, perhaps, can come wisdom. The wisdom to value what we have, to protect it fiercely, to share it generously. The wisdom to recognize that knowledge is not just power, though it is that, but also beauty and meaning and connection across the barriers that divide us. Let us think about the people who worked in the library, not just the famous scholars, but the ordinary staff. The librarians who cataloged the scrolls, who knew where everything was, who could find a requested text among thousands. The scribes who copied manuscripts, their hands cramping after hours of careful work, but continuing because they knew their labor was preserving something precious. The guards who kept watch, protecting the collection from thieves and careless visitors. The cleaners who swept the floors, kept the oil lamps filled, made sure the space was welcoming and functional. These people were not famous. We do not know their names. But they were essential. The library could not have existed without them. And when it burned, their work was destroyed along with the scrolls. The care they had taken, the hours they had devoted, all for nothing. Or perhaps not for nothing. Because for a time, the library existed. For a time, it was a light in the world, a place where knowledge was honored and preserved. The people who worked there, famous and obscure alike, made that possible. They gave future generations, including us, a glimpse of what human civilization can achieve when it sets its sights high. We should honor them, not just the Ptolemies who funded the library, not just the brilliant scholars who worked there, but all the people whose names are lost, who did the daily work that made the great project possible. They, too, are part of this story. They, too, deserve to be remembered. And we should ask ourselves, what are we doing to carry on their work? Are we supporting the libraries and archives of our own time? Are we valuing knowledge and learning, or are we allowing them to be marginalized and defunded? Are we creating spaces where the next generation can discover the joy of inquiry, or are we letting those spaces wither? These are not just abstract questions. They have concrete implications for how we structure our societies, how we allocate resources, what we teach our children, what kind of future we are building. The Library of Alexandria fell, in part, because the society that supported it changed. New priorities emerged. War and economic pressure and religious conflict took precedence over scholarly pursuits. The library was not destroyed in a day by one enemy, but gradually, over centuries, by 1,000 small decisions to value other things more. We are always making such decisions, individually and collectively. Every budget is a moral document, revealing what we truly value. Every choice about education, about funding for research and libraries, about freedom of inquiry, is a choice about what kind of civilization we want to be. If we want to be the kind of civilization that would have built the Library of Alexandria, that would have supported it and protected it, then we must make choices that reflect that. We must fund our libraries and schools and universities. We must defend intellectual freedom, even when it is uncomfortable. We must create opportunities for people from all backgrounds to pursue knowledge. We must value expertise and learning, not dismiss them. This is not easy. It requires resources, which means trade-offs. It requires tolerance, which means accepting ideas we may disagree with. It requires long-term thinking, which is difficult in a world that often seems to demand immediate results. But the alternative is to repeat the tragedy of Alexandria, to allow knowledge to be lost, voices to be silenced, the conversation of humanity to be impoverished. Surely we can do better. Surely we have learned something from history. The Library of Alexandria is gone, but the need for such institutions is as great as ever. Perhaps greater, in an age when information is abundant but wisdom is scarce, when we are drowning in data but starving for understanding, when the technologies that connect us also divide us, when the very idea of truth is contested. We need places, physical and virtual, where knowledge is preserved and made accessible. We need communities of scholars who can sift through the noise, who can separate the valuable from the worthless, who can synthesize and explain and advance understanding. We need to support and protect these places and these people, not take them for granted. The Library of Alexandria reminds us what is at stake. It shows us what can be achieved when a society commits to learning, and what can be lost when that commitment fails. It is both a monument to human potential and a cautionary tale. Let us walk, one final time, through the library as it might have been in its glory days. Let us see the sunlight streaming through high windows, illuminating motes of dust dancing in the air. Let us hear the rustle of papyrus, the scratch of styluses on wax tablets, the murmur of conversation in a dozen languages. Let us smell the cedar oil used to preserve the scrolls, mixed with the salt tang of the sea breeze. Let us see a young student, newly arrived, eyes wide with wonder at the vastness of the collection, overwhelmed and exhilarated, ready to spend years exploring this treasure house of human thought. Let us see an old scholar, bent over a rare manuscript, squinting in the dim light, making notes for a commentary that will help future readers understand this difficult text. Let us see a librarian, moving along the shelves with practiced ease, selecting scrolls for a patron, proud of his knowledge of the collection, proud to be helping someone learn. Let us see all of this, vivid and alive, and then let us watch it fade, as all things fade, as everything human eventually must. But let us also remember that while it lasted, it was glorious. And let us commit to building something equally glorious in our own time, knowing that it too will be fragile, that it too will require constant care and vigilance, but believing that the effort is worthwhile, that the pursuit of knowledge is one of the things that makes us human, that gives our lives meaning. The Library of Alexandria burned, but the flame of learning was not extinguished. It was carried forward by people who valued it, who protected it, who passed it on to the next generation. We are the inheritors of that flame. It is our responsibility now to tend it, to keep it burning, to pass it on in our turn. This is not a burden. It is a privilege. We have been given the gift of knowledge accumulated over millennia, refined by countless minds, preserved at great cost. We get to add our own small contributions, to ask our own questions, to make our own discoveries. We get to participate in the grand conversation, to be part of something larger and longer lived than ourselves. And when our time comes to pass the flame to the next generation, we can do so knowing that we honored the memory of Alexandria, not by dwelling on what was lost, but by ensuring that the work continues, that the conversation goes on, that the library, in spirit if not in stone, endures. So let us leave Alexandria now, that ancient city by the sea, with its ghostly library haunting the corners of memory. Let us carry with us the lessons it teaches, the value of knowledge, the importance of preservation, the fragility of human achievement, the resilience of human aspiration. Let us build our own libraries, write our own books, ask our own questions. Let us honor the past by creating a worthy future. The scrolls are ashes. The building is ruins. The scholars are dust. But the idea lives. The dream persists. The work continues. And in that continuation, in that refusal to let destruction have the final word, we find hope. We find meaning. We find connection across the centuries to all those who came before and all those who will come after. The Library of Alexandria is gone, but we are here. And as long as we remember, as long as we value what it stood for, as long as we commit ourselves to the preservation and advancement of knowledge, the library, in the deepest sense, is not truly lost. It lives in us, in our libraries and universities and schools, in every act of learning and teaching and discovery. This is the true monument to Alexandria, not made of stone but of human commitment, not located in any single place but wherever minds meet and ideas flourish. It is a living monument, one we build and rebuild every day through our choices and our actions. And it will endure as long as there are people who believe that knowledge matters, that understanding is worth pursuing, that the conversation of humanity across generations and cultures is one of the most precious things we have. So as we come to the end of this journey through history, as you lie in the darkness perhaps, eyes growing heavy, mind drifting towards sleep, carry with you not just the sadness of what was lost, but the hope of what endures. Carry with you the image of those scholars in Alexandria, bent over their scrolls, seeking truth, and know that their work continues in everyone who reads, who learns, who questions, who seeks to understand. The library burned, but knowledge is a phoenix. It rises from the ashes. It always has. It always will, as long as there are people who value it and protect it and pass it on. We are those people. This is our inheritance and our responsibility. And in accepting it, we become part of the story of Alexandria, part of that ancient dream of gathering all the world's wisdom in one place, not a physical place now, but the collective endeavor of humanity across time and space. Sleep well, kind listener, knowing that the work of Alexandria continues, that the flame still burns, that the conversation goes on, and that you, simply by listening, by being curious, by valuing knowledge, are part of it. You are one of the inheritors, one of the guardians, one of the voices in the conversation. And that is a beautiful thing, a connection to the past and the future, a thread in the tapestry of human understanding that stretches back to those ancient halls by the sea and forward into a future we can only imagine. Rest now, and let the story settle in your mind like sediment drifting down through clear water, finding its place, becoming part of you. The Library of Alexandria was real. It existed. It was magnificent. It was lost. But its spirit endures in us, and in that endurance is both consolation and inspiration. We cannot bring back what was lost, but we can honor it by building well in our own time, by being good stewards of the knowledge we have inherited, by adding our own small lights to the great constellation of human learning. And perhaps that is enough. Perhaps that is all we can do, and all we need to do. To remember. To learn. To pass it on. To keep the flame burning, one generation to the next, across the vast expanse of time, connecting us to those long-dead scholars who once walked the marble halls of Alexandria, and to the scholars yet unborn who will carry the work forward when we are gone. This is the meaning of the library, not just as a building but as an idea, not just as a past glory but as a present responsibility and a future promise. And in understanding this, in taking it to heart, we ensure that Alexandria, in the truest sense, never really fell at all. It simply transformed, spreading out across the world, becoming not one library but many, not one conversation but countless conversations, all connected by the shared belief that knowledge matters, that learning is valuable, that the pursuit of understanding is one of the noblest things a human being can do. So let the story of Alexandria be not just a tragedy but also an inspiration. Let it remind us what we can achieve and what we can lose, and let it strengthen our resolve to build well, to protect what matters, to pass on the light. The ancient library is gone, but new libraries arise. The ancient scholars are silent, but new voices speak. The ancient scrolls are ashes, but new books are written. The work continues. The dream lives. And we, you and I, are part of it. Rest easy, knowing this. Let the gentle rhythms of history lull you into peaceful sleep. Let the images of that ancient city fade into dreams. And when you wake, remember that you are connected to something vast and beautiful, a project that spans millennia, a conversation that includes the greatest minds humanity has ever produced, and that you, in your own way, have a role to play. The Library of Alexandria tried to contain all the knowledge of the world, and it failed, as perhaps it had to. But the attempt itself was magnificent, and it set a standard, an aspiration, that we still look to today. We still try to gather knowledge, to preserve it, to share it. We still build libraries, physical and digital. We still support scholars and students. We still believe that understanding matters. This is our inheritance from Alexandria, not the scrolls themselves, which are lost, but the impulse that gathered them, the belief that animated the whole grand project. And as long as that belief persists, as long as that impulse drives us, the library, in spirit, endures. It lives in every library, every school, every mind that seeks to learn and understand. So we have not truly lost Alexandria. We have transformed it, carried it forward, made it part of ourselves. And in doing so, we have ensured that the story does not end in ashes and ruin, but continues, evolving, growing, reaching toward a future where knowledge is more widely shared, more carefully preserved, more deeply valued than ever before. This is our task, our privilege, our connection to the past and the future. To be the inheritors and the guardians, the students and the teachers, the readers and the writers, the ones who keep the flame burning. And in this task, we find meaning, purpose, connection. We find a way to transcend our own brief lives and become part of something larger, something that stretches back to the dawn of civilization and forward into an unknown future. The Library of Alexandria is gone, but what it represented, what it aspired to, what it achieved in its time, lives on. In us. In our choices. In our values. In our commitment to learning and understanding. And that, perhaps, is the most fitting monument we could build to its memory. Not a reconstruction of the ancient building, but a continuation of the ancient work. Not a museum piece, but a living tradition. So as this story comes to its close, as the images of ancient Alexandria fade into the darkness, as sleep gently pulls you under, take with you this final thought: you are part of the story. You are connected to those ancient scholars, those patient librarians, those careful scribes. You are carrying forward their work simply by being curious, by valuing knowledge, by listening to stories from the past. And in the morning, when you wake, that connection will still be there, invisible but real, a thread linking you to the great tapestry of human learning. And perhaps you will feel, as I do, a sense of gratitude for those who came before, who built and preserved and passed on the knowledge that we now enjoy, and a sense of responsibility to do the same for those who will come after. This is the meaning of the library. This is what survived the flames. Not the papyrus and ink, but the spirit behind them. Not the building, but the dream it housed. Not the scholars, but the work they began. And as long as we remember this, as long as we honor it with our actions, the Library of Alexandria, in the deepest and most important sense, will never truly be lost. Rest now, kind listener, and let history hold you gently in its arms. Let the story of what was built and what was lost, what endured and what transformed, settle into your dreams. And when you wake, carry it with you, a whisper from the past, a promise to the future, a reminder of what we can achieve when we value knowledge and what we risk when we fail to protect it. The library is gone, but the light it casts still illuminates our world. The scrolls are dust, but the ideas they contain still shape our thinking. The scholars are silent, but their questions still echo, asking us to continue the work, to keep seeking, to keep learning, to keep the great conversation of humanity alive and flourishing. And we will. We do. Every day, in small ways and large, we honor the memory of Alexandria. We build libraries. We write books. We teach students. We ask questions. We seek answers. We preserve knowledge. We share it. We add to it. And in doing so, we ensure that the dream that built the library lives on, that the flame that burned there still lights our way, that the work that began in those ancient halls continues into a future that the Ptolemies could never have imagined. This is our legacy and our task. This is what connects us across the centuries. This is what gives meaning to the story of the Library of Alexandria, transforming it from a simple tale of loss into something richer and more profound. A story of human aspiration, of the hunger for knowledge, of the determination to preserve and share what we learn, of the belief that understanding matters and that the pursuit of truth is worth any price. Sleep well, kind listener, wrapped in the knowledge that you are part of this story, this great human endeavor, this endless quest for understanding. The Library of Alexandria may be gone, but its spirit lives in you, in me, in everyone who values learning and seeks truth. And that, finally, is the real treasure that can never be burned, never be destroyed, never be lost. As long as there are humans who are curious, who ask questions, who seek to understand, the Library of Alexandria, in spirit, will endure forever. And so we come to rest, at the end of our journey through time, having walked the streets of ancient Alexandria, having stood in the great library, having witnessed its slow fading into history. We have mourned what was lost, but we have also celebrated what endured. We have learned from the past, and we have drawn lessons for the future. And now, as the final words are spoken and the story draws to its close, we can rest easy, knowing that the work continues, that the dream lives, that the flame still burns. Good night, kind listener. May your dreams be filled with wonder and wisdom. May you wake refreshed and inspired. And may you always remember that you are part of something greater than yourself, something that connects you to the scholars of ancient Alexandria and to all the seekers of knowledge who have ever lived or ever will live. You are part of the great conversation, the endless human quest for understanding. And that is a beautiful, precious thing. Rest now. The story is told. The library has fallen and risen again in spirit. The past has spoken to the present. And tomorrow, you will carry this knowledge forward into the future, adding your own voice to the ancient chorus, keeping the flame alive, honoring the memory of what was built and lost and built again, ensuring that the dream of Alexandria, the dream of gathering and sharing all human knowledge, continues for generations yet to come. Sleep well. And when you wake, remember, you are a guardian of the flame, an inheritor of the dream, a participant in the great conversation. The Library of Alexandria is gone, but what it stood for lives on in you. And that is the most fitting tribute we could ever give to its memory.